It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate. I would say a haunted house and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. Still, I will proudly declare that there is something queer about it. Else, why should it be let so cheaply? And why have stood so long untenanted? John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick, and what can one do? If a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do? So I take phosphates or phosphites, whichever it is, and tonics and journeys and air, and exercise, and am absolutely forbidden to work until I am well again. Personally, I disagree with their ideas. Personally, I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. But what is one to do? I did write for a while, in spite of them, but it does exhaust me a good deal. Having to be so sly about it, or else meet with heavy opposition. I sometimes fancy that in my condition, if I had less opposition and more society and stimulus. But John says the very worst thing I can do is to think about my condition, and I confess it always makes me feel bad. So, I will let it alone and talk about the house. The most beautiful place. It is quite alone, standing well back from the road, quite 3 miles from the village. It makes me think of English places that you read about, for there are hedges and walls and gates that lock, and lots of separate little houses for the gardeners and the people. There is a delicious garden. I never saw such a garden, large and shady, full of box-bordered paths, and lined with long grape-covered arbors with seats under them. There were greenhouses too, but they are all broken now. The place has been empty for years. That spoils my ghostliness, I'm afraid, but I don't care. There's something strange about the house. I can feel it. I even said so to John one moonlight evening, but he said what I felt was a drought, and shut the window. I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. I'm sure I never used to be so sensitive. I think it is due to this nervous condition. But John says if I feel so, I shall neglect proper self-control, so I take pains to control myself. Before him, at least. And that makes me very tired. I don't like our room a bit. I wanted one downstairs that opened on the piazza and had roses all over the window and such pretty old-fashioned chintz hanging. But John would not hear of it. He said there was only one window and not room for 2 beds, and no near room for him if he took another. He is very careful and loving, and hardly lets me stir without special direction. I have a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day. He takes all care for me, and so I feel basely ungrateful not to value it more. He said we came here solely on my account, that I would have perfect rest and all the air I could get. "Your exercise depends on your strength, my dear," said he, "and your food somewhat on your appetite. But air you can absorb all the time." So we took the nursery at the top of the house. It is a big, airy room, the whole floor nearly, with windows that look all ways and air and sunshine galore. I never saw worse paper in my life. One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. Just dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard-of contradictions. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. I should hate it myself if I had to live in this room long. Oh, there comes John. I must put this away. He hates to have me write a word. We have been here 2 weeks, and I haven't felt like writing before since that first day. I'm sitting by the window now, up in this atrocious nursery, and there's nothing to hinder my writing as much as I please, save lack of strength. John is away all day, and even some nights when his cases are serious. I am glad my case is not serious, but these nervous troubles are dreadfully depressing. John does not know how much I really suffer. He knows there is no reason to suffer, and that satisfies him. Of course, it is only nervousness. It does weigh on me so not to do my duty in any way. I meant to be such a help to John, such a real rest and comfort, and here I am, a comparative burden already. Nobody would believe what an effort it is to do what little I am able, to dress and entertain and order things. It is fortunate Mary is so good with the baby, such a dear baby, and yet I cannot be with him. It makes me so nervous. I suppose John never was nervous in his life. He laughs at me so about this wallpaper. At first he meant to repaper the room, but afterwards he said that I was letting it get the better of me and that nothing was worse for a nervous patient than to give way to such fancies. He said that after the wallpaper was changed, it would be the heavy bedstead and then the barred windows and that gate at the head of the stairs and so on. "You know, the place is doing you good," he said. "And really, dear, I don't care to renovate the house just for a 3 months rental." "Then do let us go downstairs," I said. "There are such pretty rooms there." Then he took me in his arms and called me a blessed little goose and said he would go down cellar, if I wished, and have it whitewashed into the bargain. But he is right enough about the beds and windows and things. It is an airy and comfortable room, as anyone need wish, and of course, I would not be so silly as to make him uncomfortable just for a whim. I'm really getting quite fond of the big room, all but that horrid paper. Out of one window, I can see the garden, those mysterious, deep-shaded arbors, the righteous old-fashioned flowers and bushes and gnarly trees. Out of another, I get a lovely view of the bay and a little private wharf belonging to the estate. There's a beautiful shaded lane that runs down there from the house. I always fancy I see people walking in these numerous paths and arbors, but John has cautioned me not to give way to fancy in the least. He says that with my imaginative power and habit of story-making, a nervous weakness like mine is sure to lead to all manner of excited fancies, and that I ought to use my will and good sense to check the tendency. So I try. I think sometimes that if I were only well enough to write, a little, it would relieve the press of ideas and rest me. But I find I get pretty tired when I try. It is so discouraging not to have any advice and companionship about my work. When I get really well, John says we will ask Cousin Henry and Julia down for a long visit. But He says he would as soon put fireworks in my pillowcase as to let me have those stimulating people about now. I wish I could get well faster, but I must not think about that. There's a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck, and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. I never saw so much expression in an inanimate thing before, and we all know how much expression they have. I used to lie awake as a child and get more entertainment and terror out of the blank walls and plain furniture than most children could find in a toy store. I remember what a kindly wink the knobs of our big old bureau used to have, and there was one chair that always seemed like a strong friend. The furniture in this room is no worse than inharmonious, however, for we had to bring it all from downstairs. Then the floor is scratched and gouged and splintered. The plaster itself is dug out here and there, and this great heavy bed, which is all we found in the room, looks as if it had been through the wars. But I don't mind it a bit. Only the paper. There comes John's sister. Such a dear girl as she is, and so careful of me. I must not let her find me writing. I verily believe she thinks it is the writing which made me sick. But I can write when she is out and see her a long way off from these windows. This wallpaper has a kind of sub-pattern in a different shade, a particularly irritating one, for you can only see it in certain lights, and not clearly then. But in the places where it isn't faded and where the sun is just so, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to skulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design. There's Sister on the stairs. Well, the 4th of July is over. The people are all gone, and I am tired out. John thought it might do me good to see a little company, so we just had Mother and Nellie and the children down for a week. Of course, I didn't do a thing. Jenny sees to everything now, but it tired me all the same, and I'm getting dreadfully fretful and querulous. I cry at nothing, and cry most of the time. Of course, I don't when John is here, or anybody else, but when I am alone. And I am alone a good deal just now. John is kept in town very often by serious cases, and Ginny is good and lets me alone when I want her to. So I walk a little in the garden or down that lovely lane, sit on the porch under the roses, and lie down up here a good deal. I'm getting really fond of the room, in spite of the wallpaper. Perhaps because of the wallpaper. It dwells on my mind so. I lie here on this great immovable bed. It is nailed down, I believe, and follow that pattern about by the hour. It is as good as gymnastics, I assure you. I start, we'll say at the bottom, down in the corner over there where it has not been touched. And I determine for the 1000th time that I will follow that pointless pattern to some sort of conclusion. I don't know why I should write this. I don't want to. I don't feel able. And I know John would think it was absurd. But I must say what I feel and think in some way. It is such a relief. But the effort is getting to be greater than the relief. Half the time now, I'm awfully lazy and lie down ever so much. Dear John, he loves me very dearly and hates to have me sick. I tried to have a real earnest, reasonable talk with him the other day and tell him how I wish he would let me go and make a visit to Cousin Henry and Julia, but he said I wasn't able to go, nor able to stand it after I got there. And I did not make out a very good case for myself, for I was crying before I had finished. It is getting to be a great effort for me to think straight. Just this nervous weakness, I suppose. And dear John gathered me up in his arms and just carried me upstairs and then laid me on the bed and sat by me and read to me till it tired my head. He said I was his darling and his comfort and all he had, and that I must take care of myself for his sake and keep well. He says no one but myself can help me out of it, that I must use my will and self-control and not let any silly fancies run away with me. There's one comfort. The baby is well and happy and does not have to occupy this nursery with this horrid wallpaper. If we had not used it, that blessed child would have. What a fortunate escape. I wouldn't have a child of mine, an impressionable little thing, live in such a room for worlds. I never thought of it before, but it is lucky that John kept me here after all. I can stand him so much easier than a baby, you see. There are things in that paper that nobody knows but me, or ever will. Behind that outside pattern, the dim shapes get clearer every day. It is so hard to talk with John about my case because he is so wise and because he loves me so. But I tried it last night. It was moonlight. The moon shines in all around just as the sun does. I hate to see it sometimes. It creeps so slowly and always comes in by one window or another. John was asleep and I hated to waken him, so I kept still and watched the moonlight on that undulating wallpaper till I felt creepy. The faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern, just as if she wanted to get out. I got up softly and went to feel and see if the paper did move. And when I came back, John was awake. "What is it, little girl?" he said. "Don't go walking about like that. You'll get cold." I thought it was a good time to talk, so I told him that I really was not gaining here and that I wished he would take me away. Of course, if you were in any danger, I could and would, but you really are better, dear, whether you can see it or not. I am a doctor, dear, and I know. Bless her little heart, said he with a big hug. She shall be as sick as she pleases. Really, dear, you are better. On a pattern like this by daylight, there is a lack of sequence, a defiance of a law that is a constant irritant to a normal mind. The color is hideous enough and unreliable enough and infuriating enough, but the pattern is torturing. You think you have mastered it, but just as you get well underway in following, it turns a back somersault, and there you are. It slaps you in the face, knocks you down, and tramples upon you. It is like a bad dream. The outside pattern is a florid arabesque, reminding one of a fungus. By moonlight, the moon shines in all night when there is a moon. I wouldn't know it was the same paper. At night, in any kind of light, it becomes bars. And the woman behind it is as plain as can be. I didn't realize for a long time what the thing was that showed behind that dim sub-pattern, but now I am quite sure it is a woman. By daylight, she is subdued, quiet. I fancy it is the pattern that keeps her so still. It is so puzzling. I lie down ever so much now. John says it is good for me, and to sleep all I can. He started the habit by making me lie down for an hour after each meal. It's a very bad habit, I'm convinced, for you see, I don't sleep. And that cultivates deceit, for I don't tell them I'm awake. Oh no. The fact is, I'm getting a little afraid of John. He seems very queer sometimes. I have watched John when he did not know I was looking and come into the room suddenly on the most innocent excuses. And I've caught him several times looking at the paper. And Jenny too. I caught Jenny with her hand on it once. And I am determined that nobody shall find it out but myself. Life is very much more exciting now than it used to be. You see, I have something more to expect, to look forward to watch. I really do eat better and am more quiet than I was. Oh, John is so pleased to see me improve. He laughed a little the other day and said I seemed to be flourishing in spite of my wallpaper. I turned it off with a laugh. I had no intention of telling him it was because of the wallpaper. He would make fun of me. He might even want to take me away, but I don't want to leave now until I've found it out. There is a week more, and I think that will be enough. I'm feeling ever so much better. I don't sleep much at night, for it is so interesting to watch developments, but I sleep a good deal in the daytime. In the daytime, it is tiresome and perplexing. There are always new shoots on the fungus and new shades of yellow all over it. I cannot keep count of them, though. It is the strangest yellow, that wallpaper. It makes me think of all the yellow things I ever saw. Not beautiful ones like buttercups, but old, foul, bad yellow things. But there's something about that paper. The smell. In this damp weather, it is awful. I wake up in the night and find it hanging over me. It used to disturb me at first. I thought seriously of burning the house to reach the smell, but now I'm used to it. The only thing I can think of that is like the color of the paper. A yellow smell. I really have discovered something at last. Through watching so much at night, when it changes so, I have finally found it. The front pattern does move. And no wonder, the woman behind shakes it. Sometimes, I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. Then, in the very bright spots, she keeps still. In the very shady spots, she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. And she is all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. If only that top pattern could be gotten off from the under one. I mean to try it. There are only 2 more days to get this paper off, and I believe John is beginning to notice. I don't like the look in his eyes. He asked me all sorts of questions, too, and pretended to be very loving and kind, as if I couldn't see through him. Still, I don't wonder he acts so, sleeping under this paper for 3 months. It only interests me, but I feel sure John and Jenny are secretly affected by it. Hurrah! This is the last day, but it is enough. John to stay in town overnight, and I won't be out until this evening. As soon as it was moonlight, and that poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern, I got up and ran to help her. I pulled, and she shook. I shook, and she pulled, and before morning, we had peeled off yards of that paper. And then when the sun came and that awful pattern began to laugh at me, I declared I would finish it today. I have locked the door and thrown the key down into the front path. I don't want to go out, and I don't want to have anybody come in till John comes. I want to astonish him. I've got a rope up here that even Jenny did not find. If that woman does get out and tries to get away, I can tie her. There are so many of those creeping women, and they creep so fast. I wonder if they all come out of that wallpaper as I did. I suppose I shall have to get back behind the pattern when it comes night, and that is hard. It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please. Why, there's John at the door. It is no use, young man, you can't open it. Oh, how he does call and pound. Now he's crying for an axe. I would be ashamed to break down that beautiful door. John, dear, said I in the gentlest voice, the key is down by the front steps, under a plantain leaf. That silenced him for a few moments. Then he said, very quietly, open the door, my darling. I can't, said I. The key is down by the front door, under a plantain leaf. And then I said it again, several times, very gently and slowly, and said it so often that he had to go see. And he got it, of course, and came in. He stopped short by the door. "What is the matter?" he cried. "For God's sake, what are you doing?" I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. "I've got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane. And I've pulled off most of the papers, so you can't put me back." Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time.
So I hope everyone enjoyed or was intrigued by our presentation of the Yellow Wallpaper. And now we have the wonderful Dr. Galvan, who has decided to come back. You might, if you're one of our digital members, you might recognize her from our program about the history of vampires. But we are so fortunate for her to be back today to talk to us a little bit about the Yellow Wallpaper. And thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Galvan. So there are a lot of really interesting biographical connections from Charlotte Perkins Gilman to the story and her character that is written in first person, Jane. So could you inform us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So my understanding of the biographical connection is that after Gilman had a baby, she developed some, I think it was, I can't remember what specifically her illness was, but she needed to seek out medical help. So she sought out the help of this doctor named Silas Weir Mitchell, who at the time was a well-known neurologist, or what we call a neurologist. And he prescribed what is called the rest cure, which was a recommendation that she basically be on bed rest and do nothing that was intellectual. So no writing, no painting, no anything like that. And this was difficult for her because she was a writer. And so I think she went through that. She went by that prescription for a few months, and she said, in so many words, it almost drove her itself insane. And so she wrote this story as a response to that, because in the story, her narrator is herself essentially trying to fulfill the rest cure. And the husband is a doctor and kind of a stand-in for the medical authority that the narrator has gotten, and also trying to make sure that she does nothing but rest and never writes. And what I've heard is that Gilman actually then took the story and sent it to Dr. Mitchell. And as basically, I'm going to tell you what effect this had on me. And the other, I think, important background information is that at the time, the understanding of women's nerves was that they were very delicate. And so you have this diagnosis of this illness called neurasthenia, which is a very fragile nervous condition, a lot of sensitivity. And it was very much identified with women. And it was linked in this kind of strange medical Victorian way with the reproductive system. And the idea was that the more brain work that women performed, the more it weakened their nervous system. And so the idea that she would do no intellectual work was supposed to be a way of protecting her body, not for itself, but because she was in a maternal caregiving role. So you can really see what we think about at the time, when we think about the 19th century, we can see a real separate spheres idea of gender, where women's work is really the home, the family, childbearing, caregiving. Men's is the intellectual work of the world, the working world, government, politics, paid employment, all of that. And they really should not be mixed. And when women try to do that, they compromise their role as childbearers.
And that goes straight into the character in the story, because the character in the story is saying, you know, she just had a baby.
Yes.
So that lots of overlap
Yes,
there, and
absolutely.
try
And
almost,
really, when I teach the story too, I invite my students to think about the idea that the narrator is experiencing what we now call postpartum depression, especially when you think about the fact that when people talk about postpartum depression now, they talk about that as a misnomer, that it's not really just being blue, it's not really being depressed. It can be anxiety, it can be anger, it can even be, in some extreme cases, things like delusion, so, and psychosis. So when you, and it's because what happens with women, as we know now medically, their hormone levels change while they're pregnant, and when they give birth, the hormone levels significantly drop, something like 50%. And that's a major change then that affects women's well-being. So it's interesting to think that that was the situation, not medically known at the time in those terms, but rather it was put in this kind of separate spheres paradigm that ended up doing probably the exact wrong thing that you needed to be doing for someone who probably would have liked some other form of fulfillment in order not to simply be suffering.
Yes, because what I assume Charlotte, but also the character in the story, which seems to very much be a representation of her in a sense, wants to write and tries to sneak in writing and paint and just do something other than sit and stare at this yellow wallpaper. So can you tell us about the writing in the yellow wallpaper?
Yeah, there's so much to say about the yellow wallpaper. The fact that it's paper, one of the ways to think about it is she has been prohibited from writing. So what does she do? She's expressing herself in a different way, imaginatively, by creating in her mind some picture of this woman moving in the wallpaper, right? So in a different sense, she is writing. And the other, I also think even about the yellow wallpaper. When you think of yellow paper, you think of something very old, right? You think of something that is inherited. And for me, that kind of encapsulates metaphorically the inherited gender paradigms that she is suffering from. And oftentimes the way that what she's particularly seeing in the wallpaper is red. I mean, there's so much to be said about it, but the way that she traces the patterns and she sees the patterns kind of like go off the deep end, and that's disconcerting to her. It's kind of almost like she's projecting onto the wallpaper her own disoriented state of mind. And with that too, you can see that she's projecting onto the wallpaper herself, because what she's seeing is a woman in the wallpaper, and the woman is behind bars. The lines in the wallpaper are creating bars, and at some point she says, I can see that woman shaking those bars. And she herself is in a situation where she is basically imprisoned in this room, which, if I remember correctly too, the room itself has like the bed is nailed to the floor. And maybe there are bars on the window, if I remember that correctly. I would think because it used to be a child's room, and so it was kind of like a safety thing, which itself is meaningful, that she's been put in this kind of infantilized, childlike position, right, in an old nursery by her husband. So in short, so this idea that psychologically she's trying to grasp her mental health issues, and one of the ways she's doing that is to kind of project them onto what she sees.
I think that's interesting. You said, like, are there bars on the window? Because the text is not exactly specific on some things.
Yeah, it's not.
The narrator seems to be somewhat unreliable. So can you tell us about the literary device of the unreliable narrator and how that's used in this story?
Yeah. So the unreliable narrator, I love thinking about unreliable narration because it's such a rich topic and it can be handled in so many different ways in different texts. I mean, sometimes characters are unreliable unmeaningly, right? Sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes they're actually trying to deceive the reader. Either way, sometimes it's kind of a factual unreliability. Sometimes it's more of an ethical unreliability, right? Sometimes it's a mix. Sometimes it's about immaturity, like if it's a child narrator, right? Huck Finn is a classic example, or Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger, right? But in this case, we've got an adult narrator, and the unreliable narration does seem to be about her mental health issues. But one of the things that's interesting is that you can see the way that those, again, it's almost like her state of mind leaks out in other ways, not only in the fact that it can't be possible that there's actually a woman in this wallpaper, so we know that's some kind of delusion, but also if you look at the form of the story, like it's very short paragraphs, right? And you can see the erraticism of her thought, right? Like she gets a thought and then it's another one, and then it's another one, and then it's another one, right? So stylistically, it's reflecting her unreliability. And, I think at a certain point too, she starts to have a lot of exclamation points, right? So she's becoming more, again, erratic. And what I also think is interesting to think about how the form of the story reflects her mental condition and her unreliability. One of the things that, when I'm teaching this story too, I ask students to think about is the way, if you read the opening, before you understand what's going on, it reads like a ghost story.
Yeah.
Because she talks about them renting this old house, right? So it reads like a Gothic. And so at first, before you've gotten into it, and in fact, it's possible at first to mistake the story as a ghost story, right? That there is actually a woman in the wallpaper. And, again, you can read that symbolically in a lot of different ways. Is this the ghost of a whole tradition of femininity that is just lingering, right? So the ghost story itself as a genre is being used kind of conceptually. So is the Gothic. The Gothic is if we think about the features of the Gothic, it's often associated not only with kind of haunting and fear and this kind of grim atmosphere in old estate houses like we have here, but also with the figure of the doppelganger. So the woman in the wallpaper is her double, right? Again, that kind of projection. And oftentimes people talk about too in gender studies, the way that the Gothic can be used to think about, because the Gothic often features protagonists and characters who are trapped, often physically or mentally. And so the Gothic can be used in women's fiction to indicate a domestic entrapment, again, in a certain kind of role.
And that's so interesting, because one of the reasons why we chose to do the Yellow Wallpaper at this time of year is because it does read like a ghost story.
Yeah.
And that's when if you kind of just read it at first, you're like, oh yeah, well there's just like there's a ghost in the wallpaper. It's like, but it's so much more. So she sees this ghost in the wallpaper, or that isn't possibly really a ghost. It could just be her. It's her double. It could be her shadow almost.
Yeah.
Possibly with, depending on how you read it and what it symbolizes. But what else is there in the wallpaper? Because she also sees like these faces too, right?
Yeah. Well, and what I think is very interesting is if you do think about what she sees in the wallpaper as a projection of her mental processing of her own situation, what I always find interesting is that she both wants to let the woman out and she doesn't. She's like, that woman is trying to get out, and she takes a rope, right? At one point, doesn't she? And she is upset when she sees the woman in the garden. And I always think about that as this kind of internal conflict, which is a really realistic one when you think about it in terms of identity, including gender identity, that on the one hand, someone would want to resist things that were making them miserable, gender ideals, right? But on the other hand, there's this process that we all have psychologically of internalization, where we internalize what we're told we should be. And so there's a part of her that wants to tie that woman back up, right? And so what I think is amazingly masterful about the story is the way that Gilman manages, again, kind of like covertly, shouldn't even say it, but rendering that psychological conflict of identity.
Mhm. So there are lots of different themes in this book. It seems like, gender, this women's treatment in the medical field, treatment from doctors. Are there any other themes that perhaps we haven't touched on yet?
I feel like women's fiction at this time, to the extent that it's kind of proto-feminist, that it's trying to represent things that we understand now as getting at women's issues and women's need for different choices and independence. I think it's most interesting when it represents men in, and this is by and large the case for this fiction, as not as villains,
Mm-hmm.
but as well-meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Because her husband really does want to take care of her. It's just that he too has absorbed the norms of the time. And so, but you, on the other hand, you can hear his dialogue kind of like dripping with condescension. When he says she shall be as sick as she pleases, he's again infantilizing her, like that room itself is infantilizing her. And so, but he's also, I think, appalled when at the end of the story, when he sees, what's happened to her. And so I feel like that characterization is really interesting, because in some ways you can think about it as a social critique. It's more incisive, it's more trenchant in that he's not a villain. He's an average, well-meaning husband. And he just happens to be, as a husband, as a man, endowed with a lot of authority, to make her life miserable, essentially.
Even if he thinks he's helping, it's doing the exact opposite.
Exactly, yes.
Which is just such an interesting thing, is like, with the best of intentions, still was the worst possible outcome almost.
Yes, yeah.
That situation.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think, you asked if there was anything else, I think the other thing is that I'm not sure the narrator does have a name. I think at one point there's a reference to Jane.
Yes.
And sometimes I've seen people interpret that as she's talking about herself.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes maybe it's maybe the like nursemaid, right? Like that can be the interpretation. I don't think it's clear, and I've read the story many times and I still don't think it's clear. And I think that's interesting itself. Like, is she talking about herself? And is that looseness of our not being able to tell, is that part of that kind of doppelganger effect of every woman, even if she's looking at someone else, that really is herself as well. Every woman goes through this because of the gender paradigm. And also, on the other hand, the idea that she doesn't have a name, that she's a nameless figure, you can see how politically that would be significant as well. And that anonymity too would make her interchangeable with other women as well. But yet her husband does have a name. His name is John. And so even with that little touch too, I think that's interesting.
Because when I was reading it, I was having a hard time figuring out if the narrator was what I assumed to be Jane, the woman who's been sent there for the rescue, or if it was the character that's in the wallpaper, describing what's going on, or if it was, the physical woman. And I think that it's, like you said, it's hard to figure out. And
it's hard to figure out. Yeah. And you can think about, sometimes when you read a short story, you can think, oh, well, that's just the author being fast and loose or whatever, right? Like not pinning it down. But I always think about how much care authors take, right? With all the little details. And surely that slippage, our interpretive imbalance, is planned. So yeah.
Could you tell us perhaps why you choose Yellow Wallpaper from, there's so many Gothic short stories, but to end, could you tell us why you think the Yellow Wallpaper is important, and so important that you choose to teach it in your classes?
I like teaching the Yellow Wallpaper for a lot of reasons. One is I do like talking about unreliable narration. I think it's a very powerful mode of narration. It tends to really take off at the end of the 19th century and going into the 20th century. So, and I think its complexity is something that kind of lends itself to a modern feel of literature. So it's something, for instance, students, more trained on modern literature kind of are interested in. I also like that Gothic hybrid.
Mhm.
I like thinking a lot about genre. I like thinking about how genres are not pure, that something can seem to be one genre and really, if you look at a slightly different way, it's doing something else, or it's using features of that genre conceptually. And like I was saying, I think it does that with the Gothic. And I also just think its gender commentary is something that still hits home. It can be translated into other different forms now, but that understanding of women as always pressured to put motherhood before intellectual work, and in these kind of heterosexual couplings that privilege that, I think is something that a lot of people can relate to now as well.
Yes, it still speaks volumes to this day. And as we become more aware of different mental health issues and becoming more sensitive to that, it's an incredibly powerful story back then and as it is now. So thank you so much, Dr. Galvan, for being with us today. Greatly appreciate your incredible insight into this very remarkable story, The Yellow Wallpaper.
Sure. It was a pleasure. Thank you.